American History at University of Georgia. And it's my honor to introduce you to Julie Weissy and Yami Rodriguez. Julie, or Dr. Weiss, got her PhD at Yale University and is currently Associate Professor of History at the University of Oregon. And she is the author of Corazón de Dixie, Mexicanos in the U.S. South since 1910, which won the Merrill Curti Award for the best book in U.S. social history from the Organization of American Historians, among other honors. And the book recounts the histories of recent and historical Mexican communities, including those of Louisiana, Mississippi, and Arkansas in the first half of the 20th century, and Georgia and North Carolina in the second half. In addition, Dr. Weissy is co-producer and podcast about this history, Latinx South. She has written articles for the Los Angeles Times and the Washington Post and has been interviewed at news outlets, including Univision and NPR. And Yami Rodriguez is a graduate of University of Georgia. She obtained a master's in history at Yale University and her PhD also at Yale. Her dissertation won the Latin American Studies Association Award for the best dissertation in Latinx history in 2021. So congratulations, this just happened. Dr. Rodriguez is a historian of US Latinx communities whose work is engaged in questions of race, ethnicity, labor, and migration. Her current manuscript project, Mexican Atlanta, Migrant Place-Making in the Latinx South, traces the history of Metro Atlanta ethnic Mexican community formation with attention to the region's longer Latinx and migrant history since the mid-20th century. She is currently a postdoctoral fellow in the Department of History at Emory University. So what we're gonna do is to give first turn to Dr. Weiss, and after her presentation, Dr. Rodriguez will give her presentation. Then we're gonna have a round table. And then after that, we're going to have the floor open for questions. Don't want to forget to thank the regional system library of Athens, Clark County, and the Athens Historical Association, which is co-sponsoring this event. And thank you especially to Ashley for organizing this event. So please welcome, show me to welcome Dr. Julie Weiss.
Thank you so much, Oscar, and thank you so much for the Athens Library for inviting me to give this talk. It's always, the goal was always for the research to find its way back to communities, and so speaking at a public library is an opportunity to do that, and it's also extremely exciting to share this panel with Yami Rodriguez. No one warns you when you're starting out your academic career how super awesome it is to reach mid-career and just have these amazing scholars coming up behind you, taking the work in new directions that you never anticipated. So it's just a bit actually really exciting for me to do this with Yami Rodriguez. So I'm going to, and hello to all my family members who are here supporting me. The roving fan club. Okay, I'm going to share the screen and hopefully that will go well. Okay. Do you see the PowerPoint and only the PowerPoint? Fabulous. That was the goal. Okay, one moment. Let's organize the screens here. There we go. Beautiful. Okay, excellent. So what I have been asked to do in about 10 to 15 minutes is to give an overview of 100 years of Mexican migration to the South. No big deal. Do want to say that my research, as Yami's, has focused on Mexican immigration. Obviously, there are many other Latino, Latina, and Latinx migrant groups in the history of the South. And I'll just sort of share for those that aren't familiar with the term Latinx, because I think it'll come up today. It's a term that gets away from the gender binary of Latino or Latina, and that some, but certainly not all people prefer to use, but you'll hear that term during the various talks today, probably. But my work has focused on Mexican migration history specifically. So like many, I started asking questions about the longer history of Latinos and Latinas in the South during the 1990s and early 2000s, when all of a sudden, seemingly out of nowhere, supposedly, this large migration occurred. This is a map that highlights percent change from 1990 to 2000. No surprise, you can see Georgia was one of the major hotspots along with other parts of the South nationally in terms of percent change in Latino migration. Can you still see my screen?
We can, but we only see the cover of the book. So we just see the maps, yeah.
Fascinating. I wonder what went wrong. Okay, let's unshare and start again. Okay. Let's do it again. Okay. Can you see the map now? Yeah, okay, excellent. Okay, so my story starts, the story that I told in my book, and can you see a map of New Orleans now? Excellent, we're on track. My story starts, and it's a story that I focus on, is the history of Mexican migration to New Orleans during and after the Mexican Revolution. However, we might find similar stories if we looked in places like Mobile, Alabama, or Newport News, Virginia. This is really a story of a port city connected to the Gulf of Mexico. The Mexican immigrants who came to New Orleans during the Mexican Revolution were more middle class. Many of them were fleeing the violence of the revolution. Some opposed the revolution, whereas Mexican immigrants going to other parts of the US in this time period were more working class. However, once the violence of the revolution subsided, many of those folks went home, and as is so often the case in migration history, the route is blazed often by those who have more resources and then followed by those who have less resources. And so we ended up with a more working class community by the time we're into the 1920s and 30s in New Orleans. So throughout my research, of course, one of the questions I've had is where Mexican immigrants and Mexican Americans were imagined by the surrounding society as fitting into the racial order, and also what place they chose to claim for themselves. And I think there's so much to learn from that can inform even, present day organizing strategies and struggles. This is Robert Canedo, who came with his mom to New Orleans around 1920. And the Canedos were a part of the sort of great wave of Mexican migration to the United States. And throughout the Southwestern United States, Mexican immigrants in this period are being segregated into separate Mexican schools. And segregation was really never as hardened as it was with African Americans and white people, but it was certainly very much present in Mexican communities, Mexican and white and Black communities throughout the Southwest, including in places like California that we may not associate with Jim Crow. There was very much Jim Crow in California, and it was applied to Mexicans as well. Mr. Canedo's family, his mom was a single mother. She lived on the proceeds of her sister's boarding house. They were not a wealthy family. As you can see, he wasn't unusually light-skinned, and yet he was a part of the white school in New Orleans. So that sort of systematic discrimination that was faced in the Southwest was not faced even by working class and darker skinned Mexican immigrants in a place like New Orleans. Here we can see a map made with data that I compiled from the manuscript census, which really shows that Mexican immigrants and Mexican Americans were spread out throughout the city of New Orleans. That particular concentration of dots is in the French Quarter, which was a very sort of multi-ethnic neighborhood. And so the story of, but also you can see, really other than some of the most sort of wealthy Anglo-Saxon Protestant neighborhoods, there was a Mexican presence really throughout the city. And Mexican immigrants to New Orleans, they had their own church that the Catholic Church made, Our Lady of Guadalupe, for Mexican immigrants. But pretty quickly, most of them decided not to attend that church and instead to attend their local churches. This is really just an example of the ways that that community, in many ways, chose not to be a community. and chose to affirmatively pursue a strategy of assimilation into white New Orleans, which in most cases they were permitted to do. We actually, it's interesting, once we get later on into the civil rights movement, some of their descendants start to question the choices of their parents and say, you know, why were we so focused on assimilation? We should instead be focused on, you know, proudly identifying as Mexican, and some became involved in the civil rights movement. There's actually a family from this generation that's still active in liberal politics in New Orleans today. But for the most part, those who came in this period really assimilated into white New Orleans, and did so without extreme challenges, as would have been faced by their counterparts elsewhere in the country. The next site I'll take us to on our very rapid and grand tour is the Mississippi Delta, called by one historian the most southern place on earth. There's a long history of white planters trying to recruit immigrant labor, basically in order to break the bargaining power of Black workers after the emancipation of slaves, enslaved people. And so within that context, there had been a history of trying to recruit Chinese workers, trying to recruit Italian workers, an earlier attempt to recruit Mexican workers shortly after 1900. But this really catches steam in the 1920s. So there was basically a migrant worker system where workers would come from Mexico, spend some time in South Texas, and then join up with work crews, be sort of recruited with work crews to go everywhere: California, Alaska, the Midwest, the Northeast, as well as Mississippi. And so by the time we're in the mid-20s, there were actually thousands of Mexican workers working each year in the Mississippi Delta. And here's just a photograph of some of the places where people lived in Texas prior to that migration. So unlike the case of New Orleans, when these Mexican workers initially arrived to Mississippi, there was definitely white people picking cotton in Mississippi at this time. But in these types of sharecropping arrangements and tenant arrangements that Mexican workers were in, they were sort of seen alongside Black workers. They were discriminated against alongside Black workers, and they were most definitely not welcome in white society. Many lived with Black families as a boarder or married Black women in those sort of first years. But over time, and it didn't take that long, they were also, I'll add, excluded from the white schools by a ruling in 1926. But it really didn't take that long, actually. When some of these families started to fight back, it turned out that the primary commitment of the Southern planting class and of these rural white power holders was actually to keep Black people segregated. That was their primary commitment. And they became, they showed themselves willing to be a bit more flexible in the case of Mexicans and their children, their Mexican-American children. So this is a photo from the archives in Mexico of a case in which a man named Rafael Landrove wrote to the Mexican consulate to ask for help securing his children's admission to the white school. And amazingly, through some, I'll skip ahead here. Amazingly, through some other contacts in Mississippi, I had this photo appear in my inbox one day. A photo of Mr. Landrove and his wife taken in Mississippi. I estimate around 1930 because I can see in census records about how old the various children would have been in different years. And sure enough, in the archives of the great segregationist governor, Theodore Bilbo, the well-known segregationist governor, Theodore Bilbo, in his records, we have the letter from the Mexican consul basically saying, you know, it's really important for international relations between the US and Mexico for the Mexican kids to be allowed to attend the white school. And it worked. The governor wrote to the local authorities and he secured the Mexican kids access to the white school. And you can even see, they even have in the Mississippi Delta, the school books, the school teachers' records with the attendance and the grades, and you can see the Landrove kids re-enter school, do well in school. They struggled with English class, but were excelled in math and some other areas, and passed on to the next grade. By the time we get into the 1940s, the Mexican population is increasingly marrying white families. Some are changing the pronunciation of their last names or the spelling of their last names. And there really becomes a deliberate attempt to assimilate into the white side. And these families are still in the Mississippi Delta to this day. And this, I think, is just one of the fundamental questions of Mexican American history, as well as other Latinx histories, is, for the first half of the 20th century, some scholars have called this the Caucasian strategy, the strategy of trying to gain rights as white people rather than fight for civil rights for all. And so it's just a fascinating topic to discuss with students often is, this person was fighting for his children to be able to attend a school that actually met all year, that actually had a decent ratio that would actually educate them, because the Black schools were so underfunded that they just had very little to offer. The student to teacher ratios were extreme, and the under-resourcing was extreme. So this person was fighting for his children's rights, fighting to be free from discrimination, but he was doing so within the Jim Crow system rather than by opposing it. And so it's I think, a good question to discuss with students and others as to how people look back on that, and what can be learned from that, and how strategies have also changed in more recent times. So the next place that we'll look at is the Arkansas Delta. And this was an area sort of across the street, across the river from the Mississippi Delta. And between 1942 and 1964, Mexico and the United States had an agreement through which Mexican men were recruited to perform agricultural labor in the United States. And this agreement also led to massive flows of people that were not a part of that program. Depending on the estimate, it was either the same number that came with the program, additionally came without the program, undocumented. So other estimates might say it was 5 times as many. It's hard to pin down. But this was a program that really brought Mexican workers into parts of the United States, including Oregon, actually, where I am, where they perhaps had not been in large numbers before, and Arkansas is very much a part of that. This is the Bracero selection card of Juan Loza, who is the uncle of one of our colleagues in Mexican American history, Mireya Loza. And he was someone who was recruited to Arkansas during this period, and I had the chance to interview him. Thanks to Mireya introducing us. So these are just some photos that show a bit of what the Bracero journey was like, being recruited in Mexico, the often humiliating process of being selected by farmers' agents at the processing centers alongside the border. Here you can see the man essentially having his butt grabbed by this agent for the Growers Association, who's trying to determine if he has the right, muscles for the job, and finally headed off to Arkansas. So although we didn't previously know much about it, in many years, Arkansas was actually second only to Texas and California in terms of the number of braceros that were recruited there. So it was actually a very significant bracero recruitment site, even though it wasn't one that was maybe first on people's minds. As was the case in Mississippi, the initial reception or lack thereof of Mexican workers was one of discrimination, was one of being classed alongside African Americans and excluded from white society, from having to sit essentially in the Black section in movie theaters, doing their shopping on the Black side of town. And once again, we see a story wherein they appealed to the Mexican consulate, sort of using that international power. And they basically got the Mexican consulate involved in fighting for their rights. And ultimately they did prevail. So this is an affidavit from business owners in Marktree, Arkansas, saying, "We, the undersigned, who have in the past refused to serve the Mexicans, at a meeting with the mayor and businessmen, hereby agree that we will not in the future discriminate against the Mexicans in our place of business." They also had fines. The city assessed ordinances that would assess fines if Mexican men were discriminated against, because the Mexican government was basically threatening to pull all the workers out of the area. And by this time, the farmers were quite dependent on them. And I just think when we think about the recent waves of anti-immigrant ordinances in recent decades throughout the South, this was in a very different context and a local ordinance that was actually prohibiting discrimination against immigrants because it was so clearly identified as being in the interests of the local economy to keep Mexican workers in the area. And by all accounts, these efforts were eventually successful. And eventually Mexican men were admitted into white shops and restaurants. However, here we really have some evidence as to what they thought about race. So, okay, they're fighting to get into the white shops and restaurants, but did they actually buy into white supremacy? Did they actually see themselves as white? And in this case, we have evidence that the answer was a resounding no. Even once they had fought very hard to secure their admission to these white spaces, they continued hanging out with Black people in their spare time. They went to bars with Black people. They went to barbershops with Black people. They did not feel comfortable in white society. Even once that no Mexican sign comes down, it doesn't mean that they actually wanted to be in that space where they felt that people didn't want them there. And in oral history, there's also a lot of nostalgia from both Black people and Mexicans in this period, just remembering warm relationships with each other in that time, as a time when many Black people were actually trying to get out of agricultural labor. And so that there wasn't necessarily a sense of they're taking our jobs. On the contrary, it was where most of us, not all, but most of us are actually trying to get out of these jobs anyway. And yeah, one older African-American man told me that he'd been getting a haircut and a Mexican man came into the barber shop, and even though they didn't have a common language, he communicated that that he had been a barber in Mexico and he missed cutting hair, and that could I please cut someone's hair? And so he let him cut his hair. And so the fact that scene occurred in the Black barbershop and not the white barbershop, even once all of these, once you were technically allowed in the white barbershop, they still didn't necessarily want to go there. And so I think that's a part of how we learn about a lot of the complexity of these relationships. On the one hand, fighting for white rights, on the other hand, actually feeling that they had more in common with Black people. And I think in many ways, this story of the Bracero period, it also unlocks sort of a key moment of transition in Southern history that I think with a bit of pressure, white Southern planters and power holders basically caved on the details of segregation, on the day-to-day segregation, in order to gain access to a constant supply of low-wage Mexican laborers that would allow them to keep wages low, even as more and more opportunities were opening up, let's say for Black workers in cities and in other industries. So they sort of created this comparatively, compared to the Southwest, comparatively welcoming racial climate in order to maintain that access to labor. And that was going to be a hallmark really of Southern immigration politics, really until the early 2000s. And it's what I call the politics of pro-immigrant conservatism, which my students don't believe was a thing, but was definitely a thing until recently, pro-immigrant conservatism. Actually, most of the history of the US is anti-immigrant sentiment coming from the labor movement, coming from the left. And it's actually much more recently that has all switched. And it was those who wanted access to the labor, the business class, that actually was the pro-immigrant side. So my students struggle to fit this into their brains because of what they've lived through in their lifetimes. But that is exactly why it's actually so important for us to learn about this. Moving closer to the present, this is a map that shows, from what I can tell from documentary evidence, the earliest presence of Mexicans and Mexican Americans in Georgia, and the map shades the percent Mexicano in 1980. So this sort of shows this early development that then became, picks up speed in the 80s and really picks up speed in the 90s until the present. again, with a focus on Atlanta as well as these agricultural areas. Beginning with migrant workers who were based in Texas and Florida and used to migrate to the Midwest for part of the year. And as the crop cycles changed in Georgia, realized that they could spend a lot of their year in Georgia without having to go so far and spend so much money on gas getting where they were going. So one of the questions I have is, why didn't these farm workers organize? This was a period in the 70s and into the 80s of farm worker organizing in most parts of the country, actually, where Latino farm workers worked, but not in Georgia. And I really attribute this to that pro-immigrant conservatism, that there were conservative white people, including many church folks, such as Ruth and Sonny Bridges, who created a comparatively welcoming climate in these rural areas, who ensured that there would be, let's say, less police harassment than in other areas, who ensured that there would not be overly punitive laws on the books, who saw Mexicans as opportunities to conduct sort of international charity. And also then, of course, the grower class wanted them there as well. And so there was kind of this uneasy peace over the area. And I think here's another church family with Mexican workers in their homes. And I think that when many people were surprised by the turn of Latinos to a certain degree toward Trump, let's say, in the last election, I think we can really see how for migrant workers who employed very specific strategies to support their families while following crops in very specific ways, how for many of these families, actually these narratives of self-help and upward mobility actually resonated for them. They were conservative narratives that very much had the potential to resonate for migrant workers who had sort of built their histories in America this way, and maybe through that had made economic progress and had established themselves. I'm not saying that any of these particular families became necessarily Trump supporters, but I think there's definitely an adaptation to the conservative white culture of the area that absolutely occurred. And I haven't done research in the area since 2011, but I'd love to know where these families are at right now in terms of their relationship to white conservatism, because obviously so much has changed for immigrants and immigration politics in places like rural Georgia. So, I think one of the main takeaways, I'm not going to talk much about what's happened since then because that's more Yami's, focus. But I think one of the takeaways that I want to bring here is that really, as someone raised in Los Angeles myself, when we see this anti-immigrant movement that's been so powerful in the South for the past 15 years, I really argue that it actually came from the Southwest, that actually there were other forms of accommodation that occurred between Mexican and other Latino immigrants, others will likely find in the South over most of the 20th century. And that actually when we have this explosion of anti-immigrant sentiment in the South in the early 2000s, it really is something that is imported from the West and that is spread via Fox News and via later on, Facebook and social media. It was not inevitable that the hostile conditions that today's Latinx youth in the South have spent their lives fighting against, it was not inevitable that that was going to be the history of Latinos in the South. And it was not even historically necessarily the most typical outcome or the most typical way that things unfolded historically. And so I think understanding today's anti-immigrant climate as actually something, the way that it is right now is actually quite new in Southern history. I think it reminds us that today's historical actors absolutely have the power to bring about a different kind of future for Latinos here. And I think, something that Yami is much more of an expert in is, the ways that actually some of the political coalitions that have formed in places like the South with newer immigrant communities have actually been very innovative and actually have a lot to teach the Latino politics in other parts of the country. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Julie. Yes, we are gonna now give the microphone or Zoom to Yami. Are you still there? Where are you?
I'm still here. Maybe
All
I'd
right.
stop the screen.
All right. So we all ears.
Okay. I mean, it's just so exciting to be here with Julie again, who's like, Corazon de Dixie was the first work I read where I was like, oh, hell, I can write about this. So I'll give a sense a little bit about my personal history to give people a more close to home reason for why doing Latinx history is so important in a Southern context. So my research looks at Latinx history, and again, specifically at Metro Atlanta's Mexican and Latinx communities. I'm going to start today by sharing a brief memory turn narrative, is what I'll call it, that again will give some insight into why I do the work I do. And then I'll give everyone a sort of overview of my research project at this moment, and I'll close out with a deeper dive into what essentially I'll call a chronology of Latinx community development and placemaking in Metro Atlanta specifically from the 1950s to the early 2000s. But I like stories, so I'll start with a story. I grew up on construction sites covered with Georgia red clay, sawdust from freshly sanded doors, and those little red and yellow flags that you're not supposed to play with because, like, you know, there's danger underneath. By grew up, I mean that sometimes on weekends and days off from school, I would hop in the white work van with my dad, ladder strapped on top, paint guns loaded in the back, and we would go to whichever subdivision he was working on that week. We'd get there and we would see the stages of home building on display. On some lots, the concreteros had already laid the foundation. On others, the premiadores had already lifted the walls of the second floor. And the most finished homes in the construction process were busy being painted by men like my father, who were pintores. I'd get there, say a polite hello to the head builder, who was often a white man, rarely a white woman, but there were some. And these foremen were, supervising primarily Mexican and Central American men at work. So again, I'd say hi and then keep myself busy by exploring these homes that would soon be occupied by upper middle class families. Now, though now I understand that's who was going to be moving into those homes, it was rarely the thought of who would live there, what they looked like, and what their lives might have been that were part of my imagination. Instead, I'd hang out and watch the workers with all their skills build homes from the bottom up. And I knew that they, like my father, most likely had not finished school, most likely had limited English skills, lacked formal training, but most importantly, I knew that these workers, like my father, were building new parts of Georgia. And then we'd all have lunch. So I share this vignette to offer an example of what drives my research, which looks at Latinx community histories in a regional context. I'm currently working on a book manuscript, very tentatively titled Mexican Atlanta, Migrant Place-Making in the Latinx South. And in this project, I consider Mexican community formation since the 1970s in metropolitan Atlanta. And I consider this community formation process a cultural, political, and spatial project that illustrates how migrants make and remake spaces and places of belonging in a site defined by two things, which Julie very much touched on. One, a relatively short historical presence of large Latinx populations, and two, a site with increasing anti-immigrant sentiment and racism since the late 20th century. Now, the era between the 1970s and early 2000s saw the growth of Southern Latinx communities, and this is a moment that many scholars have dubbed the moment of the rise of the Nuevo South, or as I will call it, the Latinx South, and we can talk more about what those terms do and what they don't do in the Q&A if folks are interested in. It was also during this era that Georgia specifically became a major destination for Mexican migrants, including my own family, who moved here from Houston, Texas to Marietta, Georgia in 1994, so that my father could enter the sector of construction. Further, I'm specifically interested in telling this communal history from the bottom up through centering the voices of people like that of my father's, such as, but not limited to, construction workers, service workers, and manufacturing workers. These stories that, many of us know have been absent from traditional archives. So I draw on archival research in my work, and I've had to do a lot of recovering of materials as well, which we can talk about. And I use oral history methods to analyze the migration, labor, and sociocultural histories of Latinx community formation outside of what scholars often call traditional destination sites. When we think about Latinx communities, we think about California, about Texas, about industrial centers in the Midwest. But again, as Julie has shown, this is close to a century-long presence of Latinx people in the US South. So alongside labor histories, I also look to spaces of leisure. such as dance halls, shopping centers, and music spaces, to consider how migrants have insisted upon and defended their own right to belong as well as their dignity in a region that many continue to understand along a Black and white binary. Saying that, I'll make an important note here that Latinx people can be white and Black, but oftentimes this community is flattened to be seen as all mestizo and all Spanish speaking. So I think it's an important thing to note here that this is an incredibly diverse community. So with all of this framework in mind, who I am a little bit, what my research looks at, I'm now going to share some snapshots with y'all from my research that illustrate the decades-long history of Latinx placemakers in the specific context of Metro Atlanta and North Georgia. So these snapshots are of Southern Latinx life, are further understanding of Latinx histories that have often been overlooked and therefore incorrectly attribute to the idea that Latinx people are recent, or God forbid, a new, quote unquote, presence in the US South. As diverse Latinx communities became more visible at the close of the 20th century, there was and continues to be local pushback in the form of anti-immigrant sentiment, rhetoric, and policy that has often been specifically anti-Latinx and anti-Mexican in its nature. And again, as I'll show through these snapshots, Latinx migrants have always insisted upon their right to belong through diverse tactics, including the founding of cultural clubs, migrant serving institutions, ethnic businesses, and sites of leisure that cater to Latinx taste and sensibilities. So here I'm going to start off, before I share the fun stuff, let's see. Can folks see this chart? Thank you. Before we get into the fun stuff, let's look at the numbers. So this table here shows the growth of Georgia's Latinx population between 1970 and 2010. Well, one little box on 2010. As we know, census data often miscounts Latinx communities where there often is both a transient population as well as undocumented community members. So these numbers are are likely actually representing less than the number that's actually here. So with this data as a starting point, I offer an imperfect chronology that overlaps, but can speak to some of the critical moments of Latinx placemaking in Georgia. So broadly speaking, I'm gonna give y'all sort of 3 different cohorts of Latinx migration moments to Georgia. The first cohort is, I roughly date between 1950s through the 1970s. This was an era of some Caribbean and Latin American migration to the city of Atlanta and its surrounding areas, where Latinx migrants encountered a place with no existing migrant serving institutions and a complete lack of Spanish language social services. This was also a population where you had some Caribbean students coming to study at Georgia institutions. You had some elite, some upper class, middle class people coming to work in industries, but again, it was a very small population. The second group that I'll talk about is the group that really started to arrive between the 1980s and early 90s, before 95. This was a group made up of more working class migrants. This included more refugees from Cuba, and these refugees were much different from the 1950s in that they were seen as more working class, they were poor, Afro-Cuban, often referred to as Marielitos. And so they were a big part of this group in the 1980s, and then it began to include Mexican as well as Central American laborers who were entering service, construction, and manufacturing sectors in Metro Atlanta. As well as manufacturing and poultry processing in North Georgia and the agricultural sector in South Georgia, as Julie was discussing. The last group that I'll discuss is the group that was migrating here between the mid-90s, so from 95 through the 2000s. This was a moment, as you can see here by the numbers, when Latinx migration increased exponentially. This was the moment when scholars, when journalists, religious organizations, became aware of the increased visibility of the community. And as Julie mentioned, the question of like, what the hell happened? Where did this community come from? Seemingly out of nowhere. As I'll show, that's not the case. But this was also the era that the anti-immigrant sentiment and rhetoric, though present before, took off as Latinx migrants and their children, importantly, attempted to lay roots in the region. So again, 3 sort of cohorts, overlapping, messy, that's what history is. So let's get into the first group a little bit. So the group that I referred to as coming in the 1950s and 1970s. These migrants were small in number, and the majority were Cubans resettling after leaving Cuba under Castro's rule. These folks also tended to be more middle and upper class, had educational background, and entered professional settings, and many worked in the medicine field here in Georgia. And here, this book, a cover that I have, Los Cubanos en Atlanta, is actually a memoir turned community history written by Dr. Orlando Rojas, who was a part of this first cohort, coming to work. I believe he worked in Milledgeville for a little bit. Eventually would come to call Georgia his second home. So it was in this era that some of the first Latinx social clubs were also founded, though they tended to be, again, for middle and upper class individuals. This included the founding of the Cuban Club, which lasted since the 1970s, very unfortunately, up until last year when they had to close their doors. So despite some class privileges that existed within this cohort, the reality was that these people also confronted linguistic barriers because this was a place where there were, again, no migrant serving or Spanish speaking institutions for this community. So this further necessitated the founding of culturally relevant economic, service, and leisure spaces. So again, Los Cubanos en Atlanta, though Dr. Orlando Rojas is attempting to give this history of Cuban migration to Atlanta, it becomes this beautiful sort of like listing of the Cuban club's first members and of course the wives doing all the work of organizing these social gatherings for the Cuban men to come together and talk politics. But since the beginning, people were really like searching for community and coming together in order to be with co-patriots. So it was also through this early group that cultural brokers, as they've often been called in Chicanx and Mexican American Latinx history, became an important connecting piece between local non-Latinx populations and the migrants who were arriving in the late 70s through early 80s. So by this, I mean that non-Latinx actors, such as the Catholic Church, they were aware of a growing population. It wasn't necessarily like that in the 90s, but they were aware that there were an increase in Spanish-speaking migrants who needed services like attending church. That's not to say that these institutions were seeking to envelop Latinx people in a, in a culturally respectful way. So here, for example, this is a letter from 1969. This was a time when there were some Cuban and Puerto Rican migrants living in Metro Atlanta, totaling maybe 3,000. And the questions around these migrants, as you can see in this letter, was essentially what to do with them and how to offer Spanish services. And at the end, the letter says, the plan is to seek to avoid a Spanish-speaking ghetto, especially in metropolitan Atlanta. So this idea, again, that Spanish was a deficit, that it was a weakness, and rather than trying to create spaces for this community, attempt to force an assimilation process, right? So, and the church wasn't the only institution, social service organizations, people really trying to figure this community out, but it was relatively small. So this began to change even more by the 1980s with our second group. So in the 1980s, as I mentioned, were migrants who were more working class individuals with limited English skills and tended to have less of an educational background than the first cohort, who were able to enter white spaces more easily around Metro Atlanta and really Metro Atlanta. So through my research, I've come to understand this particular group, the second cohort, as a population that was encouraged to migrate to Georgia by word of mouth in their job sites and through family and friend networks. So again, this is not the sort of agricultural workforce in South Georgia that was coming with work visas. Rather, this was more of an informal recruitment. People might have been working in, such as this man in Jalisco making huaraches, but a compadre had come to Atlanta and opened a restaurant. People might have been working in Dallas construction or hotel service industry, but an old boss had moved to Atlanta. So this was how these people started to migrate really in the 1980s. Importantly, this era was also dominated by a majority male migration pattern, with many workers first seeing Georgia as North Georgia as a temporary site of labor, not a place to remain. People were coming with this idea, I'm gonna work, make some money, go back to where my family is. Such sentiments were perhaps exacerbated by the continued lacking, though there were some starting up, including the Latin American Association that was barely, getting on its legs in the 80s. But there still was a lack of Spanish language social services, and just as important, as I argue in my work, a complete lack of places to have fun, for lack of a better word. There were no events, there were no sites of leisure that could serve such a community. And again, increasing sentiments of alienation. You're so far from home from your food, from your people, from your spaces. Aside from the lack of leisure options, there were also few to no ethnic businesses such as tiendas that could provide culturally appropriate merchandise and food products to Latinx migrants, furthering these feelings of alienation. Now, these experiences also coincided with increased hostility and racism. So here we see a flyer from 1989, and this is, as far as I know, the first KKK rally that was specifically targeting Latinx migrants. And as you can see here, very disgusting language used, where you see the KKK in North Georgia racializing, and again, this was a primarily Mexican laboring force in Gainesville, racializing Mexicans as even worse than, quote, wild N-words. I mean, just ridiculously violent language. And this is when we start to see, again, very different from the South Georgia history, an explicit targeting of these communities that were becoming more visible in manufacturing specifically, right? So again, this moment of the 80s was a moment when people were coming to work, finding a lack of a historically standing community, finding a lack of services, and we're starting to encounter a resistance to their presence. However, by the late 1980s, a few Mexican restaurants and Latinx tiendas and services started dotting the map. Though it was not until the 1990s that these businesses, or as I'll call them, cultural institutions, really took off. So moving into the 1990s, this is the last cohort of migrants that I'll talk about. This is a moment, again, we keep hitting this point home, when the Latinx community became much more visible as demographics shifted. And this, included importantly the increased presence of Latinx women and children. So to give you an idea, as a reminder for the numbers we looked at earlier, whereas in 1970 there were an estimated 30,000 Latinx people in Georgia, by 1990 there was an estimated 108,000. By the year 2000 it was 435,000. And again, remembering that these estimates rarely account for transient laborers and undocumented community members. So it really was in this moment with the third cohort that Latinx social and nightlife expanded, not just across Metro Atlanta, but North Georgia broadly, as bailes became common. And here you see a picture that says, "Welcome to our Rincón Norteño," which was a dance hall / restaurant founded on the infamous Buford Highway in the 1990s. And we also start to see the pop-up of tiendas, Latinx restaurants, cultural festivals across the region. So on the other side of the slide, you're looking at pictures from, I believe it was 1999, a Mexican Independence Day celebration where Britos Produce, one of the first and largest Latinx sort of tienda chains in the region, you can see that they were hosting this event. So this era of dramatic increase in Georgia's Latinx population coincided with development projects in Metro Atlanta, specifically the expansion of suburban housing subdivisions and construction preparations for the Centennial Olympic Games in '96. Now, so this particular moment led many to assume that the Olympics were the major catalyst for encouraging Latinx, majority Mexican labor migration to the region. However, as I show in my work, and I hope have laid out briefly here for you today, the focus on the Olympics as the moment in history of Latinx migration to Georgia dismisses decades of place-making history that was undertaken by a very diverse Latinx population. It also erases the work of earlier arrivals who had to create community in the face of hostility to their presence. So still within this cohort, another important aspect of it is that in the late 90s to early 2000s, we see the rise of Latinx and migrant specific activism as community members sought to defend their rights and dignity. So again, a lot of attention is given to 2006 as the moment when Latinx Southerners sort of rose up and were fighting, joining a national fight for immigrant rights. But one of the first widespread campaigns was actually in 1999 when Adriana Nichols of the Georgia Latino Association for Human Rights was driving in her car around Georgia, starting a campaign for driver's licenses for all. This has been, again, the history of Latinx activism is long. I mean, at this point, yeah, we're 2 decades out from sort of its beginnings. So it was in this era that local level policy sought to limit the Latinx community's right to belong through diverse attempts. Many failed, but still they tried. So in the city of Smyrna, they tried banning Spanish language signs for businesses. In Cobb County in the 1990s, they tried asking undocumented students for proof of citizenship before enrolling. Unconstitutional, can't do that. In counties such as Cobb and I believe DeKalb, someone please correct me if I'm wrong, they passed ordinances that targeted day laborers. So they call these anti-congregation ordinances, which really attacked people who were a part of the informal labor market, increasingly Latinx laborers in this time. So at every moment, you know, people were fighting back, but at every moment they were encountering state resistance to their presence. Moving into the 2000s, the state and local counties furthered their attacks on migrant rights in the wake of a post-9/11 expansion of the security state, which extended immigration enforcement into the interior of the country. This resulted in, for example, counties entering 287G partnerships with ICE, Immigration Customs Enforcement, which allows local police departments to receive funds from ICE and conduct the work of immigration enforcement. And then later, as many of us know, Georgia passed parts of HB 87 known as the Illegal Immigration Reform and Enforcement Act of 2011. So I've just kind of laid out a bunch of like bad stuff. Again, like all of this sort of resistance and sort of effort to continuously make this community feel unwelcome, to expel them both informally and formally. But really where I want to end is that I want to reiterate that at each and every moment of oppressive state actions, Latinx people were organizing, whether through cultural and social clubs, economic boycotts, grassroots activism, or at their comadres table. People were continuously organizing to push back against the rise of the anti-immigrant state, and to lay claims of belonging in a region that often refused to see them in any other terms besides new and foreign. So today, in our present day, Latinx communities are, as we know, historically present and have roots across the South. Now, importantly, I'll say Latinx activists have entered into coalition building efforts to connect our community's histories and contemporary struggles to those of other minoritized populations, specifically and most notably with Black Southerners, Asian American communities, as well as queer communities in the South. And it is this work of coalition building and connecting struggles across racial, ethnic, and migrant identities that is inspiring and, I believe, a marker of the future of the Latinx community here in Georgia and the broader South. And with that, I thank you all for your time, and I'm really looking forward to your questions in our discussion.
Well, thank you very much for Julie and Yami for these two wonderful presentations. I have a bunch of questions here, but I'm gonna limit my list to two, so to give more time to other people in the present today here to ask their questions if they have any. So I have first a question that is aiming to both Julie and Yami. Is what challenges do you see to continue creating this historical register of the Latinx community in the South at the present time? And any of you can answer first.
Julie, I think you did this to me.
Yes.
Very hard to tell who's pointing at who on Zoom. I've got some thoughts I can share first. So I think what makes this work exciting is also what makes it challenging. So the fact that this is, maybe this seems a little bit sort of, what's the word? Confusing, because on the one hand, we're saying this community has been here since 1910, there's been a Latinx presence in the Southeast for this long. It gets harder when we want to talk about contemporary Latinx communities that are still here in the South, because we really did start to see these growing, since really the 1970s. So the challenge is these community histories aren't informal archives, right? So on the one hand, it's not like the archive is the end all be all of historical research, but it does make it harder to sort of be able to make broader claims. So I say this is a challenge and exciting at the same time, because it means that we're kind of playing historian and ethnographer at the same time. You really do have to do sort of a deep dive in communities, build trust, create reciprocal relationships in order to bring these histories to light. Yeah, so I would say that the contemporary nature of it all is challenging. And I've got other thoughts, but I'll pass it to Julie here.
Yeah, I mean, I should preface by saying that I really finished my major research for this about 10 years ago. And so much has changed since then. I guess I'll start with the good news, which is that, and I guess I'll answer here also in regards to some of these older histories of migration in the South. I think, so first is the good news. The good news is we have ancestry.com, which can help us see where people were. And I guess at this point, we're up to 1950, that should be available, publicly available. Oh, maybe not exactly. And
a year or two more until 1950 gets released.
A year or two more until, okay, so we're up to 1950. Thank you. And secondly, we actually now have keyword searchable digitized Spanish language newspapers that allowed me late in my project to learn a lot more about what was happening in Mississippi and Arkansas and Louisiana, because it was being covered from San Antonio. And so that's the good news. I think my guess is that it hopefully has gotten easier because of those things. And I just think because of increasing awareness that this group has been there for a long time in various places. And I'm certain that other historians will come along and identify communities that we didn't even know were there. I think the challenge I faced was that within the South, no one thought these communities had been there. So if we look at the example of Mississippi, there's a very, there's Mississippi Chinese heritage is a thing that people talk about. Mississippi Jewish heritage is a thing that people talk about. Mississippi Italian heritage is a thing that people talk about. And Mississippi Mexican heritage wasn't. And that's because people either moved on or made a deliberate decision not to talk about it. So everyone knew that their skin is darker and their last name's Gonzalez, and they say something like granddad came from Texas, but nobody asked questions beyond that. You just sort of leave it there. And this was a community that had for very understandable reason, chose not to be very strongly identified. And so I, remember going to the archives in Jackson, and I was actually sought out by the archivist to tell me, you're the lady here doing research on Mexicans in the Delta, right? Well, I grew up in the Delta, and I just want to make sure you very clearly understand that we had no Mexicans. And he was just very clear on that. And I've had conversations with other historians. Taya Miles, a MacArthur Genius historian, was told the same thing about the population that she was researching. In her case, the archivist heard her tell the story on the radio and sought her out to apologize. That has not happened to me. But, for me, I had to start my research in Mexico. And that's more of the good news, is that a lot of these consulates had their eye on communities. I would love to know what people would find in the archives of a country like Honduras that had, a growing population in New Orleans, let's say. I've never been there, I don't know, but I had to start my research in Mexico. It was the sources in Mexico that helped me figure out where people were and really what was going on. But the hard part was you just go to an archive somewhere in the South and there's no M for Mexican. Like it's just, when you know where to look, it's all hidden and interspersed. But it just wasn't really understood as people who existed. So that was the challenge. But I think there's increasing, with especially the digital opportunities, ways to overcome that.
Can I follow up on that question, Julie? Is this source, the honorary consuls, is it still a source that, is this something that's useful to study the present too, let's say the last 20 years, as it is from the Bracero era?
Yeah, absolutely. There's sort of, I'd say from the 70s, 80s, it kind of dips in terms of what's available. I do actually have the Atlanta records, and I reference them in my book, the Atlanta consulate records. And I met a guy at a wedding whose dad had been the consul in Atlanta in the 80s. So that, was helpful too. But I think for the more recent stuff, Mexico has freedom of information laws. One can make these requests if you know kind of what to ask for. And so, it's not like it's just sitting there in the archive in the way, but even up through the 80s, and the Atlanta stuff is there, unlike many other consuls. So one has to navigate a little bit, but consuls play a very important role in the lives of these communities to this day. And if one can get to that information, I think it's still quite useful.
So if somebody here in this audience or somebody who is going to see the recording is interested in doing history of Latinx Athens, where do you recommend to start? This is both for Yami and Julie.
So again, as someone who's driven by community stories, I recommend starting with the content curators and experts, which is the community. So, I mean, here in this call, we have, I'll give a shout, no, but yeah, Beto Mendoza, who is a pillar of the Athens Latinx community, Dignidad Immigrante in Athens. So if you're starting with, I think, growing the history of Athens, right? You want to start with very localized histories, consider who might have these histories in memory. So I would say oral history is a major methodology, especially for communities that don't have a lot of written records, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, that'd be my one major thing. Go directly to the community, as well as going to like communal spaces. Again, this is what I meant a little bit about sort of being thinking like an ethnographer, working like a historian. People, might or might not be aware of J&J Flea Market that's right there in Athens. Mm-hmm. This is an incredibly important space for Latinx commercial and cultural like sort of practices. What does it mean to actually go to these spaces and offer services as a researcher? Hey, what can I do to benefit you? And really, I guess what I'm saying is, as researchers, if you are interested in doing this kind of local history, creating a reciprocal relationship, right? Consistently questioning, how do we move away from extractive research and move towards collaborative research so that it is the community members who are shaping the archive itself. And that's something that's really exciting about this sort of collection of folks here, right? That this is the moment that community members and archivists and researchers can all collaboratively shape what the archive will look like. Yeah.
Thank you. That's a great answer. And yes, I hope this we can really do this together. Beto and Ashley and all the other people here are probably interested in that. But I have a question also for the audience here. Cindy has a question she posted in the chat. If anybody else have questions, you can either raise your hand. There is a function somewhere in Zoom to raise your hand, or you can also write in the chat, write yourself, have a question or something, or write the question and read it. There's different ways of doing this. So Cindy, can you open your mic and enter the conversation, please?
Yeah, thank you guys for those fantastic talks. I am always curious about the role of gender in immigration history, and I wonder what the presence of, in particular, of women and children has to do with your stories. To what so I can think, for example, of Chinese immigrants in the 19th century getting so much criticism and violence wreaked upon them, in part because they were criticized as overwhelmingly men, right? That there was no women and therefore they were dangerous. At the same time, it seems like when you start to go from a mostly male migration into the fields to the much greater presence of women and children when it comes to, say, Mexican migration, that invokes a negative reaction, right? When kids are in the schools, when it's just men in the fields, it's fine, right? But when there's, when it's a greater public presence, maybe, when you have women and children. So I wonder if you could address that question of what difference does gender make in the stories that you tell?
I think Cindy just summed it up quite nicely. I hadn't actually thought about that contrast to the sort of, bachelor society accusation of earlier times, because it really is in many ways a mirror image, as Cindy has acknowledged. I think one of the ways I like to think about this, and I do think that some of Trump's rhetoric changed this to an extent, what I'm about to say. But what I really see in the 90s with anti-immigrant sentiment on a large scale is a shift from attacking immigrants as workers to attacking them as consumers. Mm-hmm. And so immigrants as workers would be stereotypically men, although of course we know that that's not actually the case, that migration has been largely feminized. certainly in these industries of agriculture and construction, this idea that, you know, they're taking our jobs, which was actually the historical basis of much anti-immigrant sentiment, really sort of becomes less important, I would argue, in the 1990s, less significant than they're taking our tax dollars, they're taking my spot at the park. You know, I think about a letter that I was able to build a relationship with a conservative anti-immigrant state rep in North Carolina, and he shared with me his constituent email, which is actually not a part of the public record, but he shared it with me. And one of the letters just basically said, you know, nothing against the Mexicans, but when my kid goes to community college, there is nowhere to park. There is nowhere to park. And how can we be opening our floodgates to everyone when even my own kid who deserves to be here has nowhere to park? And so to me, that really just encapsulates, and you know, this conversation with Georgia, right? I mean, as we were just discussing with Oscar beforehand, that you know, undocumented students are prohibited in Georgia, no matter how much they're willing to pay, from attending the competitive campuses at UGA, taking someone else's, you know, within the system rather, taking someone else's spot, just like the parking spot. And so I guess that's where I see the more modern day anti-immigrant sentiment is focusing on actually on being threatened by immigrant success, frankly, by immigrants moving into my neighborhood, sending their kid to my kid's school, you know, parking in my kid's spot, as opposed to as much being threatened by the allegation of taking our jobs. So and that is a deeply gendered transition in terms of not, yes, who's coming, but also who's visible as having come.
I'll add just a little bit to that. I think Julie like covered it amazingly. But the role of gender, I hadn't really considered it until I was working on the manuscript revisions. So I would say, again, as someone who moved to Georgia as like a baby and grew up here in public schools, I very much was a part of that wave of when brown kids became visible in metropolitan Atlanta schools that had been shaped by white flight previously, right? So it's exactly what Julie mentioned. It's with the arrival of women, and again, this is a very heterosexual history we're talking about, right? I want to make that clear right now, the framing that we have right now. But with the arrival of women was the implication of in growing families. And yeah, it very much came down, I think, actually, Cindy, you said it wonderfully, greater public presence, meaning that suddenly Latinx people were in spaces that they hadn't been before because these spaces weren't the work site, they weren't the manufacturing plant, it was schools, it was parks, it was the social service agency. So, you know, just quickly, because I want to leave space for more questions, a woman that I interviewed talked about in the early 2000s, well, actually 2008, when the economic recession hit, being very embarrassed about needing food stamps and other state aid. When she went to get that request as help for her family, the comments being made, because the assumption was she didn't speak English, was that, oh, she's probably going to use this to throw her kids quinceañera. So this kind of like implication that not only are you here, you're having kids, you're also taking our resources. Yeah. Whether that be a parking spot, whether that be a spot at UGA, whether that be like food stamps, it very much becomes, again, Julie said it wonderfully, sort of a competitive marketplace of consumers rather than anything else. But yeah, gender is a central role in that. And for that, I'll suggest people read Leo Chavez's The Latino Threat, which actually very much covers exactly what we're talking about right now if people want to learn more about the gendered component of this.
Thanks.
So, excuse me, Yami, can you repeat please your recommendation for reading?
Yes, so this is one of my favorite texts because I think it's such a wonderful narrative. So Leo Chavez, and it's called The Latino Threat. And I would suggest the most updated version.
All right. I have a follow-up question for Julie. You make the observation that, okay, Beto has a question later, but let me do this, and then we go to Beto. At the end of the talk, you said that a lot of this anti-immigrant rhetoric in the South mostly came from the West. So, but in your book, sorry, this is for Julie, okay? So I'm not sure if I'm in the right spot. Okay, in your book, as you just mentioned recently, I mean, right now, the anti-immigration sentiment, especially in the greater Charlotte area, or even in the Atlanta suburban area, came from a lower middle class suburban families who were experiencing this competition for places or spaces. Can you please elaborate on these two different, I mean, they probably some have correlated, but can you elaborate on these two different positions?
Sure. So you mean between like Atlanta versus Charlotte, or California versus the South?
Yeah, you know, this anti-immigrant sentiment coming from the West, especially through the news media, or the local experiences of, you know, competing for the school system and the health and so forth.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I mean, you know, I was a teenager in California in the 1990s when we had Proposition 187, which was a very sort of similar to the things Yami was saying, you know, unconstitutional ballot initiative that ended up winning, you know, saying, you know, undocumented people can't use the hospital, even if in an emergency, they can't send their kids to school, all of which is unconstitutional. It passed with 60% of the vote, 6-0, and never went into effect because, of course, it was unconstitutional. And it was, you know, it's heralded as the beginning of the end of the Republican Party of California. And I highly recommend the 3-part podcast, The Battle of 187 by the inimitable Gustavo Arellano, the very humorous and brilliant journalist. But what he shows is what other scholars like Dan Hosang have shown, is that the people who started Prop 187, it was not, you know, there absolutely competition exists with immigrants in particular sectors, such as construction, right? But Prop 187 was not started by, you know, white or Black construction workers who lost their jobs to immigrants. It was started by accountants, dentists, political consultants, basically almost playing with the idea. It was almost, in Adriano, sort of like a game for some of them. And so, and they literally, you know, the irony is that they came up with this idea as this crazy ballot initiative they were going to try while drinking margaritas at El Torito. And so, you know, these were middle-class professionals who got this started, and their rhetoric was one of essentially, they're taking our tax dollars, they're costing us too much money. And so that's what I talk about when I talk about sort of that new wave of anti-immigrant sentiment that is distinct from that, you know, that was against, let's say, Chinese in the past, which was essentially because they are inherently racially inferior, they're able to live in inferior conditions to the white man, and therefore they're able to charge less for their labor, and therefore they're undercutting us. So I think that's what I'm arguing in terms of what came out of California in the 1990s. And what I would argue is the same rhetoric that found its way to Georgia and North Carolina. And I even found in the letters of the governor from, I believe it was Smyrna, a letter from someone saying, you know, I moved here from the San Fernando Valley, at least I grew up from the San Fernando Valley in Los Angeles. And if you drive down the street there, it looks like you're in Mexico City. And, you know, we don't want Georgia to turn into that. And so there's, in some cases, it's the very same people that are bringing these ideas. In another case, you know, many people may be aware of Alabama's very strong anti-immigrant bill. That was started by a woman who had been the head of the Republican Women's Club in Thousand Oaks, California, you know, a suburb of Los Angeles. So in some cases, it's the very same people. And I think finally, when you just look at the demographics of the places where these things took off, a lot of those white folks are from New York. You know, they're from Texas, they're from California, they're from Chicago. Like, they're not necessarily the descendants of Southern white people. So I think that's another reason that I, you know, would argue that what we've seen in the South in the past 15 years has been in many ways something national, more so than something regionally specific. And it's always so easy to dismiss anything racist in the South as a Southern thing instead of realizing that it's an American thing, it's a global thing. It's not necessarily a Southern thing.
Thank you. Okay, Beto, your question.
Yeah. And first, I want to take an opportunity of the moment, and I'm gonna ask if I can share a music album I made with stories of the migrant community during the pandemic called Voces en Pandemia. And yeah, so basically it's stories of the migrant community. And we have, there is a link in the chat you can download for free. Also, you can find it in Amazon if you want to listen. There's some songs I worked with a couple songwriters in Mexico, two songwriters in Mexico, two songwriters in Athens and me. And we have 4 songs in English in case that you guys prefer. And there's the lyrics there. But, oh, and in translations, the lyrics are translated there. But my question is very interesting. Thank you so much, doctors. And Yami was the way she was speaking inspired me to ask about the decolonization of the ways you guys do conduct research. The way, because I'm here sitting, listen how scholars talk about me, about our bodies, about our ancestors, and historically how we've been portrayed as a brazos, not as a workers, as only the serve. But any of those descriptions match me, no? Like I don't match this album, don't match my music in the schools and the streets. I mean, it's difficult to encapsulate me in sometimes in this narrative of the migrant workers, no? And I'm here, I'm a migrant worker anyway. So that's the question. I think, do you guys intentionally think and decolonize the academia, well, particularly the research or the way you collect statistics?
Beto, thank you so much for your question, because I think it's such an important question that I think, especially as historians, we may feel like we don't have to answer. But, you know, archives can be inherently violent and often are, simply by the way they're organized, who they choose to include and who they don't. So just, you know, as a community member, but not myself a migrant, you know, I do have the privilege of having been born in the States. I am a citizen. It's my parents who are migrants. So their struggle is different from my own. But as I was conducting my own research for my project, I found that one way to not put people into what Beto has called boxes, right? Your men, you were laborers. Your women, you were homemakers. Your children, you have experience from school. Rather, asking people about how they lived a full life within their migration journey. So that way, people were able to talk about their work experiences, but also what they did for fun, where they went to eat, where they found music, and essentially just really expanding what we understand to be the everyday life of a migrant person in the US. So I think in terms of like decolonizing the archive, again, I'll go back to what I mentioned about working with community members, not just in the collecting process, but quite literally in the organizing process. Because if you're gonna make a collection and call it like, you know, Laboring Lives of Latinx Migrants, people are already coming in with an idea of like what a Latinx person is. They are a laborer. So really just being intentional throughout the collecting process, the curating process. And I'm not an archivist. Maybe I'm saying something impossible, but I think it's something to strive for. And I'll say, you know, I worked with a community member who was one of the founders of Mundo Hispánico, Carola Roben, to get her materials donated to UGA. So those actually are available now. One collection is the Mundo Hispánico collection, and the other one, Beto, you may be super interested in this. The other one is a Mexican bands collection. So I think this is sort of what I'm saying, is that we really need to diversify our understandings of what Latinx life is. It's not just, you know, struggling against the state. It's not just working. It is people living full, rich lives and asking them how they understand their lives, which again is why I think oral history should be so central to building these archives and doing research. Again, that's not a perfect solution, but I think it's a starting place.
That's
Well,
awesome.
and just to speak from like the librarian and archivist kind of side of things, you know, and I'm just seeing this as a trend. In Athens, we, you know, at the public library, we have very limited resources to acquire collection, one. Two, we try our best to work within the community to acquire those collections that we have. Also, our history is generally, our collecting history as an institution is very short. We only started actively collecting since 1992. So for us, we have minimal to nothing of the Latinx community within Athens. So, you know, that's the goal of ours. And for us, like, I know for me, because I'm the person doing it essentially, is to work within the community to make that happen in some kind of way. And so the trend in these community collections is for it to be a participatory activity where we work within the community to explain the complete and total process, have community members themselves participate in the collecting, as well as the description. That's where it really counts. That's where you get the bang for your dollar, is the description process and including the community in that. Because oftentimes we as archivists and as white people don't have the language to accurately describe the material in and of itself. And so that's the big point in the archivist world, and what myself and my colleagues have talked about in conferences and literature and articles is having the collection process as well as the documentation process a collective, collaborative effort, as opposed to that theft. Because that's what it feels like, I think, now. You know, the old portion of how archivists used to work, especially in the 70s and 80s, you know, and to change that kind of tide. So, Beto, I will email you.
Yeah, I'll say thanks as well for the question. Nice emoji. Yeah, I mean, I honestly wish that I had more tools to think through these types of things when I was a graduate student doing my dissertation research. I really needed Yami as my advisor, as it turns out, because she has really developed this with great clarity in a way that, yeah, that I wasn't accessing at the time. And I think where my focus has been more recently is on figuring out how the research can be in dialogue with the community. What is the life of it after the book is out? Beyond the book that has been written, and what other stories can be written sort of inspired by that. And so one of the most exciting things I've had the opportunity to do is to work with young people, two Latino men and a Latina woman in North Carolina who grew up in the area, who I was able to find funding together with a very genius creative guy named Eric Valera, whose idea this all was, to essentially enable them to be paid to read the book and think about what was important to them in it, and talk about that with each other. And so I'll put a link in the chat later to the Nuestro South project, which is a podcast, as well as we have YouTube channel coming out soon. There's a whole life on Instagram, sort of asking people to submit their photos, to engage in conversation about being Latino in the South. Maybe Beto wants to be on an Instagram Live with us. I don't know, that would be really cool. And just really sort of youth engaging each other and in using the historical material to take what's meaningful for them and engage that in conversation. And I have to say, and I'm not just saying this, like the interview between our host Axel and Yami, I just was really sad when it was over. It's just so fun. You learn so much, and it is really so fun to listen to the two of them. They had a really amazing chemistry on this interview. So anyway, I'll post a link later. I just
posted the link.
Oh, great, thank you. Yeah, so that's some of the work that I've been doing to think some of that through. But yeah, certainly wish that I had more tools to think about that earlier on in my career.
Well, thank you. This is really a great conversation. As you just said, it's sad when it comes at the end. You just wish they keep going. But I will ask Ashley, do you want to close the event, or
yeah.
we
I'll
are
go ahead. So Thank you to Oscar, Chamosa, Julie, and Yami. I'm so appreciative, and we here at the library and just Athens in general are really appreciative of your participation today and the sharing of your knowledge.